Good evening. For those of you that I've not yet met, my name is Joanne Drake, and I am the Chief Administrative Officer of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening. Once Mrs. Reagan and our special guest arrive, I'd like to ask all of you to please remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to welcome the former First Lady of the United States, Nancy Reagan, escorted by her special guest, former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. And now, in honor of our men and women in uniform who defend our freedom around the world, please join me as Culinary Specialist First Class Maria Cordoba from Naval Base Ventura County leads us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Please be seated. Before we get started tonight, I would like to recognize some special guests we have with us. The wife of our honored guest this evening, married to him almost 60 years, Joyce Rumsfeld. From the Reagan Foundation Board of Trustees, former Governor Pete Wilson and Mr. Lodrick Cook. The wife of our hometown Congressman, Janice Gallagly. Ventura County Supervisor, Peter Foy, and Ventura County Clerk Recorder, Mark Lunn. From our own city of Simi Valley, Councilman Mike Judge, Councilwoman Barbara Williamson, and City Manager Mike Siddell. Our own Library Director, Duke Blackwood. And from Naval Base Ventura County, Commanding Officer Captain James J. McHugh, his Chief Staff Officer, Captain David Sasek, and all the active duty military members who are present tonight. Finally, on behalf of our Board of Trustees and the supporters of the Reagan Foundation, I want to thank GE for its outstanding support of our mission. GE is the presenting sponsor of the Reagan Centennial in 2011. Without them, great events like this forum would not be possible. Before we proceed this evening, I'd like to offer a moment of silence for the people of Japan. They are faced with disasters that are really beyond our comprehension. We must keep them in the forefront of our minds and hearts as we go about our own daily lives. And if you can help in any way, I hope that you will. Thank you. The format for this evening's event is going to be a little different than normal. Tonight, we're hosting a Perspectives on Leadership forum, but it's really going to be a conversation. The first part of the conversation we're all going to eavesdrop on, sanctioned eavesdropping, if you will. The second part of the program we will be participating in through the questions that you submitted when you arrived earlier. Our host is randomly selected from those questions and will use them to gain a little more insight into the story. Hosting the conversation tonight is an old friend of mine, or should I say a longtime friend. I was privileged to work with Peter Robinson in the Reagan White House, where he was a special assistant and speechwriter to the president. He will certainly be remembered by history for his contribution of the now famous line, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." President Reagan was quite fond of this line and the challenge, despite the fact that a number of his advisors and the suits at the State Department insisted over and over again it be removed from his Berlin speech, as it was too inflammatory. We all know how that one turned out. And as far as Peter is concerned, his time at the White House also turned out pretty well. He has gone beyond speechwriting to become an author in his own right. He's a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and he's both a television and online webcast host. But when I asked Peter the most important thing that came out of his time at the White House, his response was prompt and very clear. He found the love of his life there, working right down the hallway, and he credits President Reagan for that great discovery. Now, I know that Mrs. Reagan has been known to be a matchmaker over the years, but it sounds like the president can add one more notch to his belt of career accomplishments as well. And Adita is here with us tonight. Welcome. On the other side of the conversation tonight is our guest of honor, Donald Rumsfeld. Many of you know him as our nation's 21st Secretary of Defense. However, did you also know that he served as our nation's 13th and youngest Secretary of Defense? And that was in the middle of his career. He is a man who has served many masters, but only one country, and done so willingly. From 1954 to 57, he found himself in the U.S. Navy as an aviator, followed by a few years on the ground as a congressional aide on Capitol Hill. In 1962, he had to find his own team of staffers as he became one of the nation's youngest members of Congress, elected to 4 terms. He then went on to serve in various positions in the Nixon White House, before relocating to Belgium as the U.S. ambassador to NATO in 1973, during the tumultuous years of the Vietnam War. President Ford called him home from Brussels in 1974 and placed him back at the White House as his chief of staff, before eventually asking him to take over the reins of the Pentagon in 1975. And instead of a standard midlife crisis in the late 70s and early 80s, Donald Rumsfeld continued to serve this country indirectly, this time as an executive in the private sector. That is until 1983, when President Ronald Reagan asked him to take on a most interesting and certainly very demanding role as personal representative of the President of the United States in the Middle East. In fact, this is the subject of the first chapter of Secretary Rumsfeld's new book, a section most aptly entitled Lessons in Terror. In the years following that assignment, Donald Rumsfeld did not serve in a full-time government capacity, although he was consistently asked, and every time answered yes, to the literally dozens of requests by Republicans and Democrats to play a leading advisory role in developing America's most vital policy choices: arms control, ballistic missile threats, U.S.-Japan relations, the Middle East, and the global markets. In 2001, at a time in his life when most people are starting to tick off the items on their bucket list, he was once again tapped as Secretary of Defense, this time by President George W. Bush. At 9:37 a.m. on September 11th, he was at the Pentagon when American Airlines Flight 77 hit the outer ring of the building at a speed of over 500 miles per hour. In only minutes, even before the first responders arrived, Secretary Rumsfeld found himself standing outside at the crash site, trying to make sense of what would become one of the most horrific acts of terrorism the world has ever seen. Within just a few hours, Donald Rumsfeld became the first Secretary of Defense to raise the United States offensive readiness to DEFCON 3, the highest it had been since the Arab-Israeli War in 1973. In the 5 years that followed, he led our nation's defense team with force and vigor, tenacity and determination. Secretary Rumsfeld has received too many awards to list tonight, but among them is the nation's highest civilian award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And on the other end of the spectrum, I suppose it will come as no surprise that he is also a distinguished Eagle Scout. What you may not know is that in 2003, right here at the Reagan Library, Mrs. Reagan presented him with the Ronald Reagan Freedom Award for courage and leadership in the defense of freedom. Now, I'm sure you're all wondering, after this litany of career highlights, what could possibly be left to read in his book, Known and Unknown. I assure you that its 815 pages is filled with plenty of controversy, key historical decisions, and life-changing moments. I hope you will all get a copy for your personal library. The long and short of it is that Donald Rumsfeld served this country for more than 5 decades, and all along the way, he has blazed a trail, most often the youngest, and almost always the boldest. I'm told that in 2006 he retired, but it appears that he tried it, didn't like it, and went back to doing what he knows best, supporting public service and the promotion of self-sufficiency, dignity, liberty, and leadership in this country and abroad through the Rumsfeld Foundation. Is there really anything he hasn't tried and accomplished? I understand he's even become an expert tweeter on Twitter, second only to Charlie Sheen. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Peter Robinson and Secretary Donald Rumsfeld.
Oh, I'm not much of a tweeter. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. All right.
You sit first.
Okay. She makes me sound like I can't hold a job. May I say greetings first?
I think so,
before you
yes.
start firing questions
I'm
at
not
me,
going to get in
Peter?
the way. You go ahead.
Well, Nancy, thank you so much for your hospitality. It's wonderful to be here. This is a great institution and a credit to a great man. Governor Wilson, always good to see you. And ladies and gentlemen, I had a chance to shake hands and say hello to a lot of you as we signed books earlier, and I thank all of you for being here. Members of the military, thank you for your service.
I can't touch that, but I have to thank Mrs. Reagan for a lovely wife and 5 children. And by the way, there's Pete Wilson, who cut my taxes. In a moment, I'd like to discuss your service with President Reagan as his Mideast envoy. But in this library, let's talk about Ronald Reagan, the man, and how you encountered him as a leader. By the time you became a Mideast envoy for him, you had been a member of Congress, you've served Presidents Nixon and Ford, you'd gone back to the Midwest and run a great big company. And then you got summoned to Washington to work with Ronald Reagan. Known and unknown, I'm quoting from your book. He lacked the hard-charging style, and his approach took some getting used to. Explain.
He was invariably courteous, pleasant, and interested in other people. Sometimes when you shake hands with a politician, they're shaking hands here and looking there. He didn't do that. He engaged, and it was, you felt like you connected with President Ronald Reagan, and it was always a connection that you felt and walked away with, feeling you'd been with that individual.
Known and unknown again. The caricature was that he was, quote, an amiable dunce. You're quoting Clark Clifford, one of your predecessors as Secretary of Defense. The caricature, you write, simply wasn't true.
Well, it wasn't. Of course, I don't know how it's happened, but most of the presidents, Republican presidents in my adult lifetime, have been characterized roughly that way. Dwight Eisenhower, they said, had poor syntax and played too much golf, and Gerald Ford, I think President Johnson said, played too much football without his helmet. And President Reagan, as you said, Clark Clifford indicated something of a kind, and they kind of made fun of George W. Bush as being a person who wasn't a serious, inquisitive, attentive person. In each case, it was wrong. Right. And certainly in the case of President Ronald Reagan, it was wrong. He would engage you, but he would not do the kind of micromanagement and minor detail engagement. He would talk the things that were more strategic. I came away meeting with President Ronald Reagan with a sense that he would kind of plant a flag or a standard way down the road and say, that's where we're going. And then if people deviated, why, he'd tap them and recalibrate them and get them going in the right direction. Whereas, you know, other presidents have a different way of doing it. They get down into all the details, and of course, that can be counterproductive.
Known and unknown again. I'm quoting a lot from this book.
I am delighted you are mentioning the book. It keeps me from having to do that. And the reason I say that is, needless to say, when you spend 4 years working on a book and then in addition create a website, Rumsfeld.com, with 2,000, I just thought I'd mention that.
Rumsfeld.
Yeah, and I'm not much of a tweeter or a Twitter, whatever. There you are. Yes, I can see you. But when you do that, and we put, I think, 2,500 documents, thousands and thousands of pages on the website that support the book. And when you do that, you invest a major chunk of your life. And I want to make it clear that I like to have the book read, particularly by people who are seriously interested in our country and our history. But I also like to have it read because it means you have to buy it. And all of the proceeds that I would receive, or Joyce or I would receive, are going to go to the troops and their families and the children of the wounded. So those of you who came through the line and had 4 or 5 books, now you know why I shook your hand and almost hugged you.
Known and unknown, quote, shortly after the October 23rd, 1983 Beirut bombing, I received a phone call from Secretary Shultz. Remind us of that bombing. There are youngsters in this audience. Remind us of the bombing and tell us what George Shultz wanted.
The attack on a barracks that was at the Beirut airport killed 241, as I recall, American Marines, and I think 4 or 5 of the 241 were Navy corpsmen who served with the Marines. And it was a terrorist attack. A man filled a truck with explosives and drove through the gate into the building, got inside, and it just collapsed on itself. And it was probably the worst terrorist attack on Americans that had existed up to that time. And President Reagan was deeply concerned about it, and he had put these Marines in there, and they had been, large numbers had been killed. It was a coalition force, as I recall, of French and Italians and Americans, and Secretary Shultz called and said that the President has decided he needs to have a Middle East envoy, a presidential envoy, go out there and be attentive to what's taking place in Lebanon and the Middle East.
And why were we in Lebanon in the first place?
There was Lebanon's a country that we've been in previously on several occasions. There was once during the Eisenhower administration, I remember, we put troops in Lebanon. We had evacuation of Lebanon when I had been Secretary of Defense for Gerald Ford. So it's a country that has diverse elements, Shia, Sunni, Christian, Druze, and they ended up periodically getting incited against each other, often by mischief being made by Syria, a neighboring country, and a civil war, in effect. And the Syrians took almost a proprietary interest over that country, their neighboring country, to the detriment of the democratic system that they had evolved, and a very distinctly different type of constitution. But the carnage that was taking place was worrisome, and people were worried, and a coalition of countries got together, and President Reagan agreed that it was appropriate for the United States to participate in the coalition.
So we're there, there's a terrorist attack, you become the Mideast envoy, you visit the region again and again, you end up receiving what you describe in Unknown and Unknown as a lecture from Saddam Hussein. Describe that.
President Reagan and George Shultz and I talked, and the conclusion was that there's an old saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's a bit of an overstatement, friend, the word friend. But the point is valid. The point is that if you've got two people, two countries, in this case, Iran and Iraq, that were in a war, and yet they were the two most important countries in the region, and the United States of America, for whatever reason, was crossways with both of them. We know why the case was in Iran. They had taken hostages and released them at the very beginning of President Reagan's presidency. And it was a country that is run by the Ayatollahs, very hostile to the United States and to Israel and neighboring countries. Iraq, we had never reestablished diplomatic relations with since the Middle East, the prior Middle East War. When I say the Middle East War, there have been so many, it's hard to recall which one, but it was the one preceding that. And President Reagan and George Shultz and I talked and decided that it might make sense to reach out to Saddam Hussein, not that he was a Democrat of any sorts. He was a brutal dictator, to be sure, but he was, the phrase, the least worse as between the two of them at that moment with the Iranian Ayatollahs. That's what caused me to go to Baghdad and meet with Saddam Hussein representing the President of the United States.
Throughout the Lebanon crisis, I'm quoting you again, Reagan got the rhetoric right, but I could tell that formulating a consistent policy was going to be more difficult. And then you conclude our withdrawal, which turned out to be the policy, was the departure of American forces, I beg your pardon, ended up appearing frantic. Our withdrawal was met with despair by the Lebanese people. How in that complicated situation, of course the complexities take up page after page, I'm asking you to condense it for us. You have a president whose heart is in the right place, who's even analytically in the right place, saying what needs to be said, and yet it goes wrong somehow.
Well, what went wrong was the fact that the Congress of the United States let the president and his team, National Security Council team, know in no uncertain terms that they were going to cut off the funding. And that was what President Reagan was faced with. The Congress was having discussions. I went up to testify before a group of congressmen. I remember Tip O'Neill was the speaker, who President Reagan and Tip O'Neill got along very, very well, and I had served with Tip O'Neill in the Congress. And as we walked in to meet with a group of Democrats that he wanted me to speak to about what was going on in the Middle East, he turned to me and said, "Rummy, I can't give you much help with this crowd." He could feel that it was moving away from him, and that we were going to have trouble getting the proper funding and support from the Congress. And that is what eventually led President Reagan to have to make the decision he made, which was not his first choice.
Well, this brings us to the title of the book and one of your central meditations on history. We now know, I'll back up from that. We now know that those in the Middle East who considered the withdrawal from Lebanon a telltale sign of American weakness included Osama bin Laden. In 1983, why was it that events such as those that took place on 9/11 represented unknown unknowns? We didn't see it coming. Go ahead and explain your phrase, unknown unknowns.
There's a gentleman here named Dr. Bill Graham, who's you know, he's a PhD and smarter than blazes. He ran NASA for the United States of America, and we served on the Ballistic Missile Threat Commission together, along with a group of Republicans and Democrats who were very thoughtful people. And we spent day after day after day out at the Central Intelligence Agency meeting with U.S. agency intelligence analysts. And over the course of that discussion, in a discussion that we had, my vague recollection was that Bill Graham Where's your hand? Put your hand up, Bill. Where are you? There. Way back there in the back with no necktie. Way to go. My recollection was that out of Bill's mouth came something that apparently is quite common in science and in philosophy, and it is basically this truth, that there are known knowns, the things we know. There are known unknowns, the things we know we don't know, but that there are also unknown unknowns, the things we don't know we don't know. And it's the latter ones that can get you in a heap of trouble. And it was out of this discussion about the extent to which our intelligence analysts were thinking about things that they didn't know, or things they might not know they didn't know. And I remember reading a book, it was by Roberta Wohlstetter, Albert Wohlstetter's wife, and it was called Pearl Harbor. And it was about the surprise, which of course was the attack on America that preceded 9/11 that was so memorable. And in it, there's a foreword by a Dr. Thomas Schelling, and I think he's still alive and still at Maryland, maybe. I could be wrong on that, but he was at Harvard at the time. And he talked about the Pearl Harbor attack as a failure of imagination. If you think about it, surprise. The only thing today, given the nature of the world and the complexity of the world, and the nature of those that would do the United States of America and American people ill, the only thing that's surprising is that we are surprised when we're surprised. We really ought to recognize that it is a complicated world. It's not like you're looking at the intelligence people are looking at the Soviet Union over 4 or 5 decades and getting very good at it. We're looking at multiple countries, complex situations, countries that are closed societies, repressive societies. We're looking at networks of terrorists that don't even have real estate to defend. They don't have parliaments. They don't have any problems with the press. They can say what they want, lie when they want, and go right about it. They have media committees that plan how they're going to lie and plan what they're going to do. And it's a very difficult task for our intelligence people, which requires that we recognize the reality that we may be surprised. And even though there are things we don't know, we ought to be able to think about things that might happen and maybe reduce the number of instances where we have failures of imagination. Now, that's a long answer to explain the title, which you can repeat again at your convenience.
But I just want to close out this.
I should add,
sure.
When I said that in a press conference, only I was much more abbreviated, I was given an award shortly thereafter. People made fun of it as though it was a thought that was confused. And I was given a gobbledygook award. It was not a high honor. So I've gone at great length in the book to explain what it's about and where it came from. And this meeting we were having at the Ballistic Missile Threat Commission, and why it's important that we recognize the thoughts. I was told the other day, and I was ecstatic, by a person who is currently at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, who was attending a major convention of astrophysics physicians or physics people, experts, whatever you call them. And the title of his talk was this.
Did you get royalties?
No.
Because you could have given them away.
No, and he didn't get an award for gobbledygook either.
Fair enough. All right.
They applauded him.
I want to go back to 1983. How is it? Look, here's what you've heard it over and over again. We ought to have known better. That in 1983 we sent a signal of weakness, and yet one of the meditations of this book is that you have to be careful when you're judging figures from history. You have to be realistic. They were human. They knew what they knew. They operated in the circumstances in which they operated. So I just want to give you an opportunity to make a kind of closing statement about 1983, what we knew and what we imagined, what seemed realistic.
You know, there's a phrase, and unless you're a Mozart or an Einstein and you go off in a closet and think of something brilliant, all the rest of us, what we do with other people. And we do it through discussion. And I don't know where this phrase came from, but it's as important a phrase as the title of the book. And it is that weakness is provocative. If you think about it, if Dwight Eisenhower said peace through strength, meaning if you're strong, you can have peace because there will be a deterrent and people will be dissuaded from engaging in things that they otherwise might like to do, but they could see that the penalty for doing it would be serious. And so when you think about the phrase, weakness is provocative. And to the extent a country, particularly a major country, the United States of America in this instance, does something that reflects weakness or hesitation or a lack of resolution, that message is taken by the enemy. And they then decide, well, that's an opportunity, that's an advantage. And I think that what you're suggesting is that Osama bin Laden watched what took place there. And in a series of things, the attack on the USS Cole and various things that occurred in our nation's history, and drew the conclusion that the United States of America was a paper tiger, I think, to use this phrase. And there are videos and documents that trace the attitudes of enemies of the United States, in this case, radical Islamists, people who have a totally different worldview than people who value nation states and free political institutions and free economic institutions. And they concluded that sure, dealing with the United States Army is one thing, not an attractive thing because they're strong. Dealing with the United States Air Force, the United States Navy, not attractive. However, asymmetric attacks against the United States, not against your major strength, but against your major weaknesses. And by major weaknesses, what I mean, obviously, are the center of gravity of an asymmetric war is not on the battlefield, it's in the United States of America. It's in the minds of the American people and their representatives in the Congress. And that is the message that came out of a series of terrorist attacks where people concluded that they could engage in these kinds of things and that we really were not really well organized, trained, or equipped to deal with them, and therefore that weakness on our part made it attractive for them to engage in those activities.
Listen, I haven't taken you over the coal bed of Iraq, because anybody who wants to see the Secretary answer questions on Iraq can go to YouTube. You've been asked in every single interview. And if our few moments together does nothing else but establish the importance of the first two-thirds of the book, so that's what I'd like to, let's step back in a few more moments before we go to questions from the audience. I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, that here we are well into the 21st century, and we're hearing from a man who took the oath of office as a member of the United States Congress when the Speaker, John W. McCormick, was born in the 19th. So,
the 19th century?
The 19th century. 1891. I looked it up. I
have now lived 1/3 of the history of the United States of America.
So your work.
I mean, you multiply 78 times 3 and subtract it from 2011, and you're right back at the very beginning. And it shows you what a young country we have, or what an old man I am.
Clare Boothe Luce once said that history would give even the greatest figures only one sentence apiece. Lincoln freed the slaves. Churchill saved Britain. Let me ask you about the men you knew and worked for as president, and ask you to give me a sentence or two.
Before I do that,
Go ahead.
And I'm happy to do it. I had lunch one time with Clare Boothe Luce, and she was on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and we were having a gathering. And at some moment, she was talking about communism. It was in the period when Euro-communism was kind of the good communism. Can you imagine that? And she and President Reagan's focus was laser-like on the subject. And someone made some comment that was slightly imperfectly constructed. And she stood up and said, this is Claire Booth Luce in a group of people who served on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. She said, we must not grant them moral equity. And that is, in fact, what was happening when you think about Euro-communism being the good communism as opposed to the bad. And it was a powerful thing when you think about it, because, I mean, you think what President Reagan said, talking about the Cold War, and he said it's not complicated. The way I look at it, we win, they lose.
Okay.
That is strategic thinking.
Let's stick with that. Known and unknown. I'm quoting from this marvelous book, of which you cannot buy too many copies, and please pay full retail. Quote, for a number of years before Reagan took office, the architecture of foreign policy had been built around the notion of peaceful coexistence or détente. Robinson, your interviewer, inserts, you served a couple of the presidents who were architects of that policy, or at least helped to operate that policy, Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. Now we continue your quotation. Reagan knew that major strategic changes in U.S. policy could be made. The time was ripe. He saw more deeply. Explain what was distinctive about that moment and that president.
If I'm not mistaken, it was in President Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson. I was in Congress and he was president, and they talked about, I think it wasn't, they didn't use the word détente, they used the word spirit of Glassboro. I think
That's right, Glassboro, New Jersey. That's right. He gave a speech up there. That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
And it was basically, look, the communists have their views, we have our views, and let's see if we can't reduce tensions by dealing with them. And there's a certain logic to that. And I talk about it at some length in the book. And the logic is that you, obviously, war is a failure of foreign policy. You don't want war. It's the last thing on God's green earth that you want to have. And so you try to figure out ways you can work with people that you have differences. And that was what the thought was from Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and during the early part of the Ford administration. The problem with it was that it caused us to relax. And what was happening, the Soviet Union was going up like this in terms of their military capabilities. And they were down here and we were up here, and we were relaxing. We were détenting, if you will. And we were coming down. And it was inevitable that when I came in as Secretary of Defense in the 70s, we were in a period of rough equivalence. But we were heading down and they were heading up. And we were relaxing and they weren't. They were spending roughly what Adolf Hitler was spending in Germany in terms of a percentage of their gross domestic product back in the mid-70s, showing a real seriousness of purpose that they intended to try to gain superiority. As it turned out, their economy was a communist economy, a command economy. It didn't work very well, and President Reagan sensed that and took a number of steps that caused them to eventually collapse.
Lady Thatcher, Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot. Fair sentence for him to get for history?
Yes.
Richard Nixon. I'll give you
You
two
know what,
sentences. That's a tricky one. I'll give you two sentences.
No, let me just tell you about Mrs. Thatcher.
Of course.
You can't bring her up and drop it like that.
No, I can't. You're right.
President Reagan sent me to be special envoy for the law of the sea. And there was a provision in there on seabed mining that there ought to be a, quote, authority run by 190 countries that would decide how we would handle the values that exist under the oceans, the seabed mining issues. And President Reagan decided that he didn't think that was a great idea. And so he called me in, and Ed Meese, and they started suggesting I travel around and talk to some countries and try to talk them out of supporting this. They were already scheduled to have a signing ceremony in Jamaica with 150 countries, and the question was who was going to go sign it. And President Reagan said, well, I don't think we ought to sign it. And I think it was Secretary of State Haig at the time said, well, the question is who signs it? And he said, well, wasn't that what the election was about? And so I went over, he sent me over to talk to Mrs. Thatcher, and I explained to her how it would work. And she said to me, well, what you've described sounds like the international nationalization of 2/3 of the Earth's surface. And you know what I think of nationalization. You can tell President Reagan I'm with him. And she just carved through all of the debate and discussion in a second and supported him. To her credit and to President Reagan's credit, excuse me for doing that.
No, that's a bonus answer. We've got to... Now, Richard Nixon. Give us a sentence or two on Richard Nixon.
Strategic, brilliant, in a profession that he was socially not comfortable with, and a tragic in the sense of being the only president in our history who had to resign. And instead of going off and curling up in a corner, he came out of an illness and started writing books and contributing and adding to the important national and international dialogue on public issues. He, thanks to Milton Friedman and a group of us who got together, is responsible for having an all-volunteer military. Mm-hmm. And it is, we have the finest military we've ever had. And history will have to say that, I mean, I testified for it in the 1960s when I was a young congressman, and the old bulls in both of our parties did not want it. They liked the draft system. And it took a president coming in and pushing it. And as a result, every person serving is there because they want to be there. Every person there is someone who made a conscious decision. That's something I want to do. And the effect it's had on our military and on our country has been terrific. I'd say one other thing about Richard Nixon. He wasn't a people person socially, but he was a person who picked people and brought them into government. And a lot of the people who served in the Reagan administration were people who had come in the Nixon administration. I mean, George Shultz, for example, right. and any number of others had come in during that period. He's an interesting man, and it's such a sad thing that he is the one person who's had to resign.
Gerald Ford.
Came into the presidency never having run for president or vice president, the only man in history. Didn't have a campaign team, didn't have a platform, had never served in an executive position, had one of the worst economies in our history. Mm-hmm. The Vietnam War was tailing down and about to be shut off by the United States Congress and ended. The reservoir of trust in the country had been drained dry. If you walked out to the press corps in the White House when Gerald Ford came in and said, that's the ceiling, everyone in the press corps would say, I wonder why he's saying that. There must be some sinister reason that he would suggest that that's the ceiling. And thanks to this wonderful human being, just basic human decency and niceness and character, the reservoir of trust was refilled in our country, and the country was healed, and we didn't have the kind of terrible crisis that could have occurred.
George W. Bush.
Terribly underestimated, a person who it was described in the press, as I said, as uncurious, I think was the phrase they used. And I mean, you'd go to meetings with him and he asked penetrating questions, was seriously interested, who I would be in meetings with him with foreign leaders, I probably with 15 or 20 different heads of state over the 6 years I was his Secretary of Defense. And he would, he would develop relationships with them that were very helpful to our country. And he did it because he was intelligent and interested in them and had an ability to engage people in a way that was human and interested, as well as intellectual. He also knew people he didn't like. And for a president, there's nothing wrong with that.
Last question, before we go to questions from the audience. What sentence? I know you've got 815 pages here. What sentence would you like history to accord to Donald Rumsfeld? Careful, or I'll ask Joyce.
Well, I think it would simply be he served. And
That's good. That'll do. That'll do. I wonder if Mrs. Reagan recognizes this gesture. I learned to hide the cards in my pocket and pull them out with my right hand from your husband, who is better at it than I am. By the way, I don't think I've ever told you this, but when I was leaving the White House, I had my photo session with the president, and he said, "Thank you for that speech in Berlin. I was very eloquent in Berlin."
I love it.
Questions from the audience. Princeton class of
54.
54.
Seems like only yesterday.
Do you think the Princeton faculty would support General Washington if the Battle of Princeton were being fought today?
Not a chance. They just hired Van Jones, who was fired from the Obama White House, to speak at to be at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton.
Have you spoken there on your book tour at your alma mater?
No.
All right.
No.
Mr. Secretary, my grandsons, F-18 pilot on the USS Reagan. West Point, class of 06, back from Afghanistan next week. I'm sorry.
06?
Yes. And this is a new question now. This is someone who's telling you about grandchildren and says, will they be safe in the future? Or will our defenses be strong enough?
We have a terrible practice in our country of reacting, I suppose, like all human beings do. We do it as a society. Fear focuses the mind, and necessity is the mother of invention, I think Benjamin Franklin said. And when people are concerned, they act. And what we do then is we build up our capabilities and strengthen our deterrence and our defenses, and we have a more peaceful period. If that peaceful period goes on very long, we relax, and we go back down, and you can look at defense funding, and it's like a bathtub right after a period like that. After the Reagan administration, I'm going to say 8 years before President George W. Bush came in, the 8 years before that, it went down like that. And it had done that prior to the time that President Reagan came in. President Reagan got Cap Weinberger, and they beefed up the defenses. And then when the 8 years of the Clinton period, it was a calmer time. People relaxed. The Cold War was over. They talked about peace dividends. And of course, we relaxed, and we ended up with a military that did not have the kinds of capabilities that would really give us that kind of strength that would assure deterrence and defense and therefore peace.
Let me follow up with that question by asking what I think is a question underlying a lot of the public debate right now. I go back to your entering Congress in January 1963, when John Kennedy still had 9 months to live, and the United States was unquestionably the most powerful nation on earth. We've talked about Ronald Reagan rebuilding our defenses, reestablishing national morale, winning the Cold War, and now look at where we are. China rising, our economy in a perplexing state of stagnation, the current chief executive who has added more to the federal deficit in his brief time in office than all the presidents before. And there is some underlying notion, you run into it over and over, at least I do, over and over again, that in some basic way the wheels are coming off the American project. That we may be, or I heard in Washington in fact it was the day after you and I spoke in Washington 2 weeks ago, Marco Rubio, the 39-year-old senator from Florida, saying that every generation in American history has provided a better life for its children than the previous generation. We run the risk of being the first that fails to do so. How do you answer this woman who asked about the safety of their grandchildren? When you look into you have grandchildren, how do you answer that question?
The senator is correct. We have generation after generation been able to be reasonably comfortable and confident that the next generation would in fact have a better life and a good life. I do not believe that you can incur the kind of debt that we're incurring in this country and expect that that would continue. And yet, you know, in my lifetime, I've seen, if you think about the American people, I think of kind of a gyroscope that you have to get centered periodically, or a pendulum. It goes too far one side, and what happens when it gets way over there? Good people get out of their chairs, they pay more attention, they get engaged, and they push that thing back where it belongs. And so we center ourselves and root ourselves. I have, maybe it's my experience in my life, but I just have enormous confidence in our country and in the American people. And I don't think we're going to allow this kind of debt to saddle future generations. I think that at some point, people will step up and get sufficiently engaged that they'll stop it. It can't go on. There is no way in the world this country can do what we're currently doing and expect to have future generations have the kind of life that we've had. We're saddling them with a debt that it can't be borne.
I'm following up my own follow-up, but then I'll end it. We talked about Claire Booth Luce. Henry Luce, her husband, wrote a famous essay at the close of the Second World War describing the 20th century as the American century. Will the 21st century be another American century?
You know, this world of ours, without leadership from the United States of America, would be a very different place. Day after day, in different parts of the world, in different ways, the United States of America sets an example or makes a contribution. And literally, if you go to the embassies around the world of the United States and go there at nighttime, and you'll see people lining up out there waiting to come to our country. If no other thing than as a symbol, as a land of opportunity, as a place that sets an example. The United States serves in that way. We also, I mean, what we did, for example, with the tsunami in Indonesia, what we did with the earthquakes in Pakistan, what this country does is it's the most generous country on the face of the earth, privately and publicly. And I read a lot about China, and I pay attention to what I read, and there are a lot of smart people who are looking at things there. But, you know, we see our problems right up close. We get our eyes right up against the window and look at our problems. And we've got problems, let there be no doubt about it. But, I mean, so does China. They've got terrible demographic problems. They've got problems where they still have enormous government-owned enterprises that are about as inefficient as any government-owned enterprise. And they have trouble with their neighbors on the north. They have trouble with their neighbors on the south in Vietnam. They have troubles with India. Their future is not perfect. They're going to have a bumpy road. The economic disparity from the coast to the inland part of that country is just enormous. The one baby policy that resulted in male babies and not girl babies has created an imbalance in their society. So I don't see them on a smooth path that is, as some like to think. Now, clearly, they're making enormous investments in their defense capabilities. They're running around the country in Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere in the world, passing out money and building presidential palaces and buying yachts for leaders of countries and winning friends, to be sure. And that's a fact, that they're going to be a factor. But I mean, Russia, is not going to be a major factor in the future. They, you know, with the exception of energy, their economy is probably about the size of Portugal, and it's the first. Nothing wrong with Portugal, but it's they're you know, I mean, they're probably
Is that old Europe or new Europe?
I did say old Europe one time, and people keep asking me if I want to take it back. And I remember someone wrote me and said, just on demographics alone, I was right.
We have time for, I think, just a couple more questions.
I'll give shorter answers.
Well, on this one, I have a follow-up on this one in mind, so don't let this one go too long. I have a feeling it could go long. Do you remember how the turbine, this is just a slightly technical moment here, do you remember how the turbine-powered Abrams tank got started?
Do I ever? I was Secretary of Defense. The year was 1976. It was about 7 o'clock at night. I am not technical. I didn't study engineering or anything like that. Into my office came the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bill Clements, who had owned and run Sedco Corporation, and a fellow who's here today, and I know he asked this question, I'm sure he asked the question, named Malcolm Curry, Dr. Malcolm Curry. Where's Malcolm Curry? There, raise your hand. There is Mal. So those two came in, and with them, they had General, I think it was Dutch Kerwin. Is that right? And the Secretary of the Army, Martin Hoffman. And the four of them walk in, and they don't agree. The Army wanted to have a diesel engine on the new tank that was going to last, what, 50 years, the tank. I don't know how many years, but the Army was unanimous that we absolutely had to have the diesel engine. And as I recall, 105 howitzer. Malcolm Curry and Bill Clements came in with the technical background and knowledge. They said you ought to have a 120 millimeter cannon and you ought to have a gas turbine engine on a tank, which had never been done in history. And it was 7 o'clock at night, and they said, you have to decide it. We don't agree. I said, oh, thanks a lot, gents. Thanks for the heads up 2 weeks ago. Nothing. I mean, you talk about bad management. And they kept trying to work it out, and they couldn't, and finally they came into my office. So I said, well, I'm not going to decide that. That's a terribly important thing. It's going to go on for years. We're going to have that tank, whatever it is. I'm not going to make a mistake. I'm going to try to do it right. So I'm going to announce that we're not going to, they said, if you announced you're not going to decide on our tank, the Congress will explode, the press will explode, the defense industry will explode. They'll all go after you. And I said, tough apples. I said, no, we're going to take 6 or 8 weeks. We did. We ultimately picked the turbine engine that Malcolm Curry and Bill Clements recommended with a 120 millimeter howitzer, and it has performed brilliantly for the United States Army. And then that evening, after I told them what I was going to do, the Army said, we've already put out the press release saying it's the diesel engine with the 105 millimeter howitzer. I said, we'll go pick up the press releases. And they went into the offices and tried to extract them. But it was not a perfect example of how to manage something, but we ended up right, didn't we, Malcolm?
Bear that in mind. The brass doesn't always get it right.
That's for sure.
So this has got to be the last question. You do anything with this question you want to. You become Secretary of Defense for the second time around, and your principal goal is defense transformation. To take this gigantic structure that's been erected to fight a Cold War, which is now over, and reconfigure it. And then, of course, 9/11 happens, and attention in the press, of course, moves to Iraq. But you didn't stop working on defense transformation. Give us, we only have a few moments, but give us what a layman ought to know, what a layman needs to hang on to about how the Pentagon is different today from the day it was, from the configuration it was in when you became Secretary of Defense for the second time.
Actually, it was not my idea. It was President George W. Bush. He'd given a speech at the Citadel, and he said that this country has got to engage in transforming the Department of Defense and bringing it into the 21st century and into the information age. And he was exactly right. And when he asked me to serve as Secretary of Defense, that was the assignment I was given. You are also correct when you suggest that 9/11 not only did not stop the effort to transform, but it actually helped to provide an impetus to get the department moving. And of course, the department is enormous. It's 3 million people, I don't know, 7 or 8 or 900,000 civilian employees and millions of military and defense contractors. And what we did during that period, the 6 years I was there, is just by way of example, we repositioned our forces around the world. They were basically where they were at the end of the Cold War, just in place. And we were spending $236 million keeping U.S. aircraft in Iceland to prevent the Soviet bombers from attacking the United States in 2001. There were no Soviet bombers. There was no Soviet Union. But we were spending 230. We still had troops in the Sinai. We had people in places where they had been, and no one wanted to change it. It took me 3 years to get the Iceland thing changed, but we got it changed. $236 million a year down the drain because of bureaucracy. I mean, dealing with the federal government is it's kind of like getting in bed with a hippopotamus. It feels warm and good for a minute or two, and then it rolls over and crushes you. And it doesn't even say it's sorry because it didn't know you were there. We dramatically increased the number of unmanned aerial vehicles. You know, pilots like to fly. I was a Navy pilot. I love to fly airplanes. Who wants to have unmanned airplanes? That's not what those of us did. We did it. The benefit today for the United States of America with the dramatic increase in unmanned aerial vehicles is significant. Special forces, we've significantly increased the number of special forces. We increased their authorities, we increased their equipment, and they're on the spear point. In an asymmetric war, they are critically important people, and they're being given the kind of support today. We even got the Marine Corps involved in the special forces in MARSOC. The other thing we've done, which is probably the most important, anyone here who served in the Army knows that the divisions were the Army. They were the historical entities. They had songs. They had history books. They had pennants. And they were how we dealt with things. And they were big. We have shifted completely to a brigade combat size, which are lethal, mobile, and we wouldn't even begin to be able to do what we're doing today if we were still basically functioning on a division basis. So the Department of Defense is moving into the 21st century. There's a lot more to be done. You don't begin untransformed and end up transformed. It's a continuum. It's a process of transforming, and it's never going to end, and the world's going to keep on changing. We're going to have to deal with things like cyber warfare that we don't even have rules of the road for today. But we made good progress, and I was proud to have a president who was determined to see that we made progress because he was absolutely convinced it was in the best interest of the country.
Ladies and gentlemen, Donald Rumsfeld has been serving the country since he became a naval aviator more than half a century ago. Will you join me in thanking him?
Thank you. Thank you.